Let me tell you about the day my life took a turn for the ridiculous. It started with a letter. Not just any letter, no, this was the letter. The kind of letter that arrives in an envelope so unnecessarily official, it makes you question if you accidentally committed treason while binge-watching Netflix. The HOA seal was embossed on the front, shimmering like it had been forged in the fires of Mount Bureaucracy. I stared at it for a good 5 minutes, wondering if I should open it or just burn it and move to Canada. Curiosity won, and I tore it open. The contents were, well, let's just say they were peak HOA nonsense. Dear Mr. James Carter, the letter began, in a font so pretentious it could only have been chosen by someone who owns 3 fountain pens and calls their Wi-Fi network Chateau de Connectivity. It has come to our attention that your home network violates Section 14.3b of the Oakwood Estates Community Covenant regarding unauthorized wireless signals. Unauthorized wireless signals? I blinked at the page, half expecting it to start glowing like some ancient scroll from a fantasy novel. What did they think I was doing? Running an underground cybercrime syndicate from my living room. I kept reading. Your network's signal strength exceeds acceptable limits and may interfere with other residents' devices. Please cease operation immediately or face penalties, including but not limited to fines, disconnection of services, and further legal action. I laughed, loudly, so loudly that my dog Rufus, who had been peacefully napping on the couch, woke up and gave me a look that said, "Are we being robbed? Interfering with other residents' devices?" What were they worried about? That my Wi-Fi was going to hijack their smart fridges and order 300 pounds of kale. This had to be a joke. But then again, this was the HOA we were talking about. The suburban overlords who once fined my neighbor for having the audacity to paint her mailbox a shade of blue that wasn't on their approved color palette. These people didn't joke. They regulated. Now, if you've never had the pleasure of living under an HOA, let me paint you a picture. Imagine a group of people who take themselves far too seriously, like hall monitors who never grew out of their power trips, and give them control over your property. That's an HOA. My particular HOA, Oakwood Estates Community Association, or as I like to call them, the Fun Police, was notorious for their absurd rules. They once sent out a memo banning inflatable holiday decorations because they were aesthetic pollutants. Another time, they tried to enforce a rule requiring all front lawns to have exactly 3 bushes. No more, no less, or face fines. And don't even get me started on their obsession with driveway cleanliness. I swear these people would inspect driveways with magnifying glasses if given the chance. So when this letter arrived accusing me of running some kind of rogue Wi-Fi operation, I wasn't entirely surprised. Annoyed? Yes. Surprised? Not at all. Here's the thing. My home network isn't just Wi-Fi. It's practically the lifeblood of my household. We've got smart lights that dim themselves based on the time of day, because flipping switches is apparently too much effort. Security cameras that keep an eye on Rufus when he decides to chew on furniture, and gaming consoles that keep me sane after long workdays. My wife works remotely as a graphic designer, my kids rely on stable internet for school projects and online classes, and well, let's just say my Call of Duty kill streaks depend heavily on low latency. Cutting off my network would be like cutting off oxygen. Not just inconvenient, but downright catastrophic. And yet here was this letter from the HOA threatening to throw us back into the digital Stone Age because my Wi-Fi signal was allegedly too strong. Too strong? What did they think I was doing, broadcasting pirate radio signals across state lines? I decided to investigate further because surely there had to be some mistake. Maybe someone in the HOA office had accidentally spilled coffee on their keyboard and sent out this nonsense by accident. But no, this was very much intentional. I called Karen from the HOA office. Yes, her name is actually Karen. Hoping for some clarity, Karen answered with her usual tone, a mix between condescension and passive aggression, and informed me that my network's signal strength had been flagged during one of their routine inspections. Routine inspections? What were they doing, walking around with Wi-Fi detectors like suburban Ghostbusters? Karen explained that my network might be interfering with other residents' devices and disrupting community harmony. Community harmony? Was she serious? This wasn't Woodstock. It was Wi-Fi. I asked her what exactly I was supposed to do about this alleged interference. Her response? We recommend switching to our preferred internet provider to ensure compliance. There it was, the real motive behind this nonsense, money. Turns out Oakwood Estates had recently signed an exclusive deal with some third-rate internet provider whose speeds were slower than dial-up in 1998, but whose prices could bankrupt a small nation. By forcing residents to switch over, the HOA would get a nice little kickback while we suffered through buffering YouTube videos and laggy Zoom calls. At this point, I was livid, not just because they were trying to mess with my internet, but because they were messing with my freedom. This was America, land of the free, home of unlimited data plans. Who were these people to tell me how strong my Wi-Fi could be? I hung up on Karen mid-sentence, a deeply satisfying moment, and stared at the letter again. My first instinct was to crumple it into a ball and throw it at Rufus like some kind of stress relief therapy toy, but no. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was war. If they thought they could bully me into submission with their ridiculous rules and shady business deals, they clearly didn't know who they were dealing with. I wasn't just some passive suburban dad who'd roll over at the first sign of conflict. I was James Carter, homeowner extraordinaire and defender of high-speed internet, and so began my quest for vengeance. A quest fueled by righteous indignation, caffeine-fueled brainstorming sessions, and an unshakable belief in justice. The first thing you need to know about losing your Wi-Fi is that it's not just an inconvenience. It's a full-blown existential crisis. The moment the HOA threatened to cut off my internet, I started imagining the worst-case scenario. What would life even look like without my beloved network? Spoiler alert, it wasn't pretty. Let me paint you a picture. Imagine waking up in the morning and reaching for your phone, only to realize there's no Wi-Fi, no news updates, no weather forecast, just that little spinning wheel of doom as your apps desperately try to connect to a non-existent signal. It's like being stranded on a digital desert island, except instead of coconuts, you've got a useless smartphone and a growing sense of panic. In our house, mornings are powered by two things: coffee and Wi-Fi. Without one, the other becomes meaningless. My wife, Emily, was the first to crack under the pressure. She works remotely as a graphic designer, which means her entire job depends on having a stable internet connection. The second she realized her work files wouldn't sync, she turned to me with the kind of look that could freeze lava. "James," she said, her voice dangerously calm, "if I miss this client deadline because of your illegal Wi-Fi setup, I'm going to start charging you for lost income." I tried to explain that this wasn't my fault, that we were victims of an oppressive HOA regime hellbent on destroying our digital freedom, but she wasn't having it. "Just fix it," she snapped before storming off to find a coffee shop with free Wi-Fi. Rufus followed her out the door, clearly deciding that siding with Emily was the safest bet. Then there were the kids, two teenagers who treat Wi-Fi like oxygen. The moment they realized the network was down, they reacted like I just canceled Christmas. "Dad?" My son, Ethan, yelled from his room. "The Wi-Fi's not working. I can't get into my online class." "Me neither," my daughter, Lily, added from down the hall. "And I was supposed to submit my science project today. This is literally ruining my life." Now, I know what you're thinking, why didn't they just use their mobile data? Well, here's the thing. Our cell service in Oakwood Estates is about as reliable as a politician's campaign promises. Without Wi-Fi, their phones were basically glorified calculators. I tried to calm them down by suggesting they do something offline. Read a book, maybe? You would have thought I'd suggested they take up competitive knitting based on their horrified expressions. "Books?" Ethan said, his voice dripping with disdain. "What is this, 1990? Lily wasn't any more receptive. "Dad," she said slowly, as if explaining something to a particularly dense toddler, "I need Google for my homework." As if dealing with Emily and the kids wasn't stressful enough, I had my own problems to contend with. For starters, no Wi-Fi meant no gaming, my one escape from the chaos of suburban life. I tried booting up Call of Duty anyway, hoping against hope that maybe the HOA hadn't actually followed through on their threat yet. Nope. The game lagged so badly that my character spent most of the match running into walls while other players gleefully shot me in the back. It was humiliating. Then there was Netflix, or rather, the lack thereof. Emily and I had been in the middle of binge-watching some true crime documentary about a guy who faked his own death by jumping off a cruise ship. Spoiler, he got caught, and now we couldn't finish it. I tried suggesting we watch something on DVD instead. Yes, we still own DVDs, but Emily just gave me a look that said, don't even start. By day 2 of our internet drought, things had gone from bad to worse. Emily had taken up semi-permanent residence at the local coffee shop where she claimed to be working but was probably just venting about me to anyone who would listen. The kids were sulking in their rooms like prisoners in solitary confinement. And Rufus? Rufus had decided that without access to his favorite YouTube channel for dogs, yes, that's a thing, he might as well chew through every pair of shoes we owned. As for me, I was starting to unravel. Without online distractions to keep me sane, I found myself doing things I hadn't done in years, like organizing our junk drawer or reading HOA bylaws just for fun. Spoiler, they're not fun. At one point, I even considered taking up gardening. Me. The guy who once killed a cactus because he forgot it needed water. The worst part was knowing this whole mess could have been avoided if it weren't for the HOA and their ridiculous rules about unauthorized wireless signals. Every time I thought about Karen and her smug tone on the phone, my blood pressure spiked. By day 3, Emily came home from the coffee shop with an idea, or rather an ultimatum. James, she said firmly, we can't live like this anymore. Either you figure out how to fix this Wi-Fi situation or we're moving. Moving? I repeated incredulously. You want us to uproot our entire lives because of some power-hungry HOA? Yes, she said without hesitation. Because at least then we'd have internet. I knew she wasn't bluffing. Emily never bluffs when it comes to her work deadlines or her Netflix queue, but moving wasn't an option. For one thing, we just spent a small fortune renovating our kitchen last year. For another, well, okay fine, I didn't want to leave because I liked our house. Sue me. So there it was, my mission was clear. If we were going to survive the suburban nightmare without packing up and leaving town like fugitives on the run from bad Wi-Fi karma, I needed a plan, and fast. But first, coffee. Because let's be honest, no one can take on an HOA without caffeine in their system. Just when I thought life couldn't get any worse, the cavalry arrived. And by cavalry, I mean my dad, Richard Carter, a man who could fix anything from a broken toaster to a nationwide cybersecurity breach. If James Bond had a nerdy older brother who spent his weekends tinkering with Raspberry Pi projects instead of chasing villains, it would be my dad. The man was practically a walking Wikipedia, except he didn't ask for donations every 5 minutes. When I called him to explain my predicament, he didn't even flinch. HOA nonsense again, he said in his usual no-nonsense tone. I'll be there in an hour. That's my dad, always ready to drop everything and ride into battle armed with nothing but his laptop and an unshakable sense of justice. True to his word, Richard showed up exactly 1 hour later. He stepped out of his car carrying a toolbox that looked like it belonged in a spy movie and a laptop covered in stickers that read things like, "Hack the planet," and "I void warranties." Rufus barked excitedly as if sensing that salvation was at hand. "Let me see the letter," Dad said as he walked into the house. I handed it over, and he read it with the kind of expression you'd expect from someone analyzing classified government documents. After a few moments, he let out a low chuckle. "Well," he said, "this is ridiculous even by HOA standards." "Tell me about it," I replied. "They're basically accusing me of running an illegal Wi-Fi cartel." Dad shook his head. "They've overstepped their boundaries. FCC regulations clearly state that homeowners have the right to operate personal networks within their property. This isn't just petty, it's illegal." I stared at him in awe. How did he know this stuff off the top of his head? Did he memorize federal statutes for fun? Without wasting any time, Richard set up shop at the dining table, transforming it into what looked like a miniature command center. He pulled out gadgets I couldn't even name, things with blinking lights and wires sticking out like they belonged in a sci-fi movie, and started typing furiously on his laptop. "What are you doing?" I asked, trying not to sound completely clueless. "First," he said without looking up, "I'm going to map your network and pinpoint its signal strength. Then I'll compare it to FCC guidelines to prove that your setup is perfectly legal." "And then?" I asked hesitantly. "Then," he said with a mischievous grin, "I'm going to make sure the HOA regrets ever messing with us." I didn't know whether to be scared or impressed. Over the next few hours, Richard worked like a man possessed. He started by running diagnostics on my network, muttering things like bandwidth allocation and signal interference under his breath as Rufus watched him intently from under the table. At one point, he pulled out a device that looked suspiciously like an antenna and stuck it on top of the router. "What's that for?" I asked. "Boosting your signal," Dad replied casually. "If they're going to accuse you of having unauthorized wireless signals, we might as well give them something worth complaining about." I couldn't help but laugh. This was revenge at its finest, subtle yet brilliant. Next, Richard drafted a letter addressed to Karen at the HOA office. But this wasn't just any letter, it was practically a legal manifesto outlining every federal regulation they were violating by trying to shut down my network. He even included citations from FCC documents and court cases that proved homeowners' rights to operate personal networks free from interference. "Send this," he said confidently as he handed me the letter. "And make sure they know we're not backing down." But Richard wasn't done yet. Oh no, he had one more trick up his sleeve. "I'm setting up a VPN," he announced as he typed furiously on his laptop. "A VPN?" I repeated dumbly. "Yes," Dad said patiently. "A virtual private network will encrypt your internet traffic and make it impossible for them to monitor or interfere with your connection." "But can they even do that?" I asked nervously. "They shouldn't be able to," Dad replied, "but given how shady this HOA is, I wouldn't put anything past them." Within minutes, my network was protected by what Richard described as military-grade encryption. He even added extra layers of security just for good measure, because apparently my dad doesn't do anything halfway. By the time Richard finished setting everything up, it was nearly midnight. My wife had returned from her coffee shop exile looking slightly less furious, and the kids had finally stopped sulking long enough to eat dinner. Even Rufus seemed calmer now that our digital fortress was secure. "Well," Dad said as he packed up his tools, "that should do it. Do you think they'll back off?" I asked hopefully. Richard smirked. "Oh, they'll back off all right, unless they want me filing complaints with both the FCC and every tech blog in America." I couldn't help but laugh again. My dad might not wear a cape or fight crime in Gotham City, but he was definitely my hero. The next morning, I sent Richard's letter to Karen at the HOA office along with copies of all the legal documents proving our network's legitimacy. Within hours, she called me back sounding much less smug than usual. "Mr. Carter," she said hesitantly, "we've reviewed your case and decided not to pursue further action regarding your network." Translation: they knew they were beaten and didn't want to risk getting sued into oblivion. When I told Richard about Karen's response later that day, he just shrugged like it was no big deal. "Typical bureaucrats," he said dismissively. "They only back down when they realize you know more than they do." And just like that, peace was restored in Oakwood Estates, or at least in my household. As for the HOA? Well, let's just say they won't be sending me any more letters anytime soon. Richard packed up his laptop and toolbox before heading home that evening, leaving behind nothing but a perfectly functioning network and an overwhelming sense of gratitude. "Thanks for everything," I said sincerely as he walked out the door. He turned back with a grin. "Anytime," he replied before adding cheekily, "just try not to get yourself into any more trouble." I laughed again because honestly, with an HOA like ours, trouble was practically inevitable. Just when I thought the battle was over, the HOA decided to make one last desperate attempt to assert their dominance. It started with another letter because of course it did. This time, the envelope was even more official-looking, complete with a red, urgent stamp that screamed, "We're really mad now." I opened it cautiously, half expecting glitter bombs or anthrax. "Dear Mr. Carter," it began in the same pompous font as before. "While we acknowledge your recent correspondence regarding your home network, we remain concerned about its potential impact on community harmony. As such, we request your presence at an emergency HOA meeting to discuss this matter further." An emergency meeting? For my Wi-Fi? What were they planning, a tribunal with torches and pitchforks? I could practically hear Karen sharpening her metaphorical claws as she typed this nonsense. When I told my dad about the letter, he didn't even blink. "Good," he said simply. "Let's go show them who they're dealing with." And so, armed with Richard's legal expertise and my newfound confidence, I prepared for what would undoubtedly be the most ridiculous showdown of my life. Emily insisted on coming along for moral support and possibly to keep me from saying something that would get us evicted, while Ethan and Lily begged to stay home and document the drama via text updates. The meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m. in the HOA clubhouse, a building that looked like it had been designed by someone who hated joy. The walls were beige, the chairs were uncomfortable, and the air smelled faintly of stale coffee and crushed dreams. The room was packed with residents who had clearly been bribed into attending with promises of free snacks. Karen sat at the head of the table like some kind of suburban dictator, flanked by her loyal minions, the HOA board members, who all looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. "Mr. Carter," Karen began in her usual condescending tone, "thank you for joining us this evening." I forced a smile. Wouldn't miss it for the world. Karen cleared her throat dramatically before launching into a speech about community values and the importance of maintaining harmony. She talked about how my network was allegedly interfering with other residents' devices and causing disruptions, though she conveniently failed to provide any actual evidence. When she finally finished her monologue, which felt like it lasted an eternity, she turned to me with a smug expression. "Do you have anything to say in response?" Before I could open my mouth, Richard stood up like a tech-savvy knight ready to slay the dragon. He pulled out a stack of documents so thick it could have doubled as a weapon and placed them on the table with a satisfying thud. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began calmly but firmly, "what we're dealing with here is not a matter of community harmony, it's a matter of legal overreach." Karen's smug expression faltered slightly as Richard began outlining every single federal regulation that protected my right to operate a personal network within my property. He cited FCC guidelines, court cases, and even obscure technical standards that made her argument look like Swiss cheese. And let's not forget, Richard added with a sharp smile, the HOA's attempt to coerce residents into switching to their preferred internet provider is not only unethical but potentially illegal under antitrust laws. At this point, Karen looked like she wanted to crawl under the table and disappear. The other board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, clearly wondering why they'd signed up for the circus. But Richard wasn't done yet. Oh no, he had one more ace up his sleeve. "I've also taken the liberty of running diagnostics on Mr. Carter's network," he continued smoothly. "As you can see from these results," he held up a graph that looked like something out of NASA, "his signal strength falls well within acceptable limits and poses no risk of interference to other devices." He passed copies of the graph around the room while Karen tried and failed to maintain her composure. "And if anyone would like further clarification," Richard added with a mischievous glint in his eye, "I'd be happy to explain how Wi-Fi signals work in layman's terms." The crowd burst into laughter because, let's be honest, nobody wanted a lecture on Wi-Fi physics at 7 p.m. on a Tuesday. By the time Richard finished his presentation, it was clear that Karen had lost control of the narrative. Residents started murmuring amongst themselves about how ridiculous this whole situation was. Some even openly criticized the HOA for wasting everyone's time on such petty nonsense. One brave soul raised his hand and asked Karen point-blank why she hadn't bothered to consult an actual tech expert before accusing me of wrongdoing. Her answer? A weak mumble about protocols that didn't satisfy anyone. In the end, the board had no choice but to back down. They issued an official statement declaring that my network was perfectly legal and promised not to pursue further action against me or anyone else for their Wi-Fi setups. As we left the clubhouse that night, Emily turned to me with a grin. "Well," she said teasingly, "looks like you won your little war." I laughed. It wasn't just me, it was Dad. Richard shrugged modestly but couldn't hide his satisfaction. "Just doing my job," he said with a wink. Life returned to normal after that, well, as normal as it gets when you live under an HOA known for its absurdity. Karen avoided me like the plague whenever we crossed paths in the neighborhood, while other residents started calling Richard for advice on everything from internet security to lawn care regulations. As for me, I finally got back to gaming without lagging into oblivion, and yes, I managed to finish that true crime documentary about the guy who faked his own death. Spoiler, he got caught. But more importantly, I learned something valuable: never underestimate the power of family or high-speed internet in the face of bureaucratic tyranny. If you've ever dealt with an HOA or fought for your right to enjoy uninterrupted Wi-Fi in your own home, drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your story. And don't forget, if you enjoyed this tale of suburban rebellion and tech-savvy revenge, hit that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe for more content just like this. Because remember, together we can defeat bad policies, one router at a time.